Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the economy in Venezuela, because unfortunately, the problems are continuing to mount for the country with the largest oil reserves in the world. You would have thought having a huge amount of oil would mean that you'd be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But unfortunately, if you're not allowed to exploit and sell that oil, then you can't monetize it, and therefore you're going to experience problems. And in terms of how much oil Venezuela actually has, it is a huge amount. You can see from this graphic that the estimated reserves are over 300 billion barrels, which is almost double the reserves that Canada has, is 3.75 times more than Russia has, and almost 5.5 times more than the USA. And if Nicolas Maduro, who's the president of Venezuela, was hoping that Donald Trump being voted in as the president of the USA was going to be good news for him and his economy, he was unfortunately very wrong, because things have actually got worse. On the 26th of February, Donald Trump announced that he was reversing a license that had been given to Chevron, the US oil business, by Joe Biden in November 2022 to operate in Venezuela and to export oil to the USA. Now, the reasons why Joe Biden issued the license to Chevron to operate in Venezuela in 2022 were firstly that Chevron was owed around $3 billion by the Venezuelan authorities. And secondly, at that time, the US needed to secure more imports of oil to balance up their supply and demand. So it ticked both of those boxes. However, following his re-election in 2024, there were a lot of problems in Venezuela, and the US authorities accused Venezuela of rigging the elections and said that they needed to see serious reforms being implemented, firstly to show that it was a free and fair election, and secondly that there were no humanitarian issues continuing in Venezuela. Now, the US authorities are saying that Venezuela haven't met any of those conditions, and this is the reason why Donald Trump has now revoked the license. But this is going to cause a major problem for Venezuela, because firstly, the authorities were receiving around $3 billion per year in terms of their cut of the revenue that Chevron were producing, but also the amount of oil that Chevron was producing was huge. They were pulling 240,000 barrels of oil per day out of the ground, and that represents over 27% of the total amount of oil being produced in Venezuela. And one of the problems that Venezuela has right now is that its oil industry is in decline as a result of a lack of investment, because none of the companies within Venezuela have enough money to actually keep investing into all of the equipment to keep it up to date. And also, they're restricted in terms of where they can export their oil because of the sanctions that are applied against the country. And to make matters worse, it's now been announced that Trinidad and Tobago are seeking a USA extension for Shell's gas project in Venezuela. And obviously the reasons why the Chevron license was revoked will also apply to the Shell license, and so it's very likely that that renewal will not be approved, and so we are going to see a general reduction in terms of oil and gas activity in Venezuela, which is going to be bad news for all of the companies involved, but seriously bad news for the people in Venezuela, because there'll be less work, and also the authorities won't be getting any tax revenue or any other share of revenue from the sale of all of those assets. Now, just before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about Incogni, who I've partnered with for today's video. One of the things that drives me absolutely insane is spam marketing, whether it be text messages or emails or my pet hate, phone calls. People phoning you up to have a chat and to try to sell you something. And the reason why you're getting more and more spam marketing is because of data brokers. Data brokers can take your personal information and sell it on the internet. But the problem that you've got is that how do you stop those data brokers from doing that? Well, you can actually contact each individual one of them and try to get them to take you off their database. But who's got the time to be able to do that? Well, the answer to that is Incogni. Once you sign up with Incogni, they will contact all of the data brokers and have your data removed, and they will also protect you from cybercrime and identity theft. And the great news is that you can get a 60% discount off an annual plan, which is what I use, by going to incogni.com/Joe Blogs or clicking in the link in the description below. Now, unfortunately, from Venezuela's point of view, the problems with regards to the changes that Donald Trump is implementing don't just stop with oil and gas. At the end of January, the Trump administration revoked an extension of deportation protections that the previous Biden administration granted to more than 600,000 Venezuelans already in the USA. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem rescinded an 18-month extension of the Temporary Protected Status Program, which allowed for people to temporarily stay in the US if they cannot return safely to their home country. The federal program is available for people fleeing ongoing armed conflict, environmental disasters, or extraordinary and temporary conditions. The designation gives people the legal authority to be in the country, but does not provide a long-term path to US citizenship. Joe Biden's Homeland Security Secretary had issued the extension to Venezuelans, citing the severe humanitarian emergency the country continues to face due to political and economic crises. And following on from the removal of the temporary protected status, it was announced that deportation protections had also been revoked, which means that 300,000 Venezuelans living in the USA are now facing the risk of deportation, and a further 250,000 who have protected status up until September may also be added to that number, giving a total of 550,000 Venezuelans that could be deported before the end of 2025. Now, interestingly, President Maduro of Venezuela has confirmed that Venezuela will accept all of the people that are deported from the USA, and in fact, they will pay for their safe transfer back to the country. But that's going to be a huge bill if the USA does round up 550,000 people and flies them all back to Venezuela at Venezuela's cost. Okay, here's a quick question for you. Can you name the 3 countries that border Venezuela? Well, the first one that sits alongside it is Colombia. The second is Brazil. And the third one, which is probably the most tricky, is Guyana. It was formerly known as British Guyana when it was part of the British Empire. It actually became part of the British Empire in 1796, but Guyana gained its independence in 1966. However, 2/3 of Guyana is hotly disputed by Venezuela, an area referred to as ESSEQIBO. And one of the reasons why Venezuela is so interested in ESSEQIBO is because it has lots of reserves. It has huge oil and gas reserves, and it also has a lot of gold and diamonds. Now, interestingly, the US oil major ExxonMobil has been working in Guyana since 2008 and has had an operational oil facility for the past 5 years and is now producing 650,000 barrels of oil per day and has a target of increasing that to 1.3 million barrels per day by 2027. And just to put that into context, in 2024, Venezuela produced 892,000 barrels of oil per day. So very soon we will see Guyana overtaking Venezuela in terms of its oil production. In fact, that might happen over the course of the next few weeks if Chevron have to close down their facilities as a result of losing their license. And this is despite the fact that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And Venezuela now wants ESSEQIBO back. In fact, President Maduro held a referendum at the end of 2023 where he asked the people of Venezuela to vote in favour of giving him powers to take back the area by force if necessary, and he said that that referendum resulted in a 98% positive outcome. Now, there's a lot of question marks over whether or not that was a fair referendum and whether it was actually a true vote count, but that's what he's saying. So he now believes that he has the authority from the Venezuelan people to take back ESSEQIBO by force. And it's been reported that on the 1st of March, a Venezuelan patrol ship entered Guyana's waters and positioned itself near a vessel contracted by ExxonMobil. And in response to this, the USA said, Venezuelan naval vessels threatening ExxonMobil's floating production, storage and offloading unit is unacceptable and a clear violation of Guyana's internationally recognised maritime territory. Further provocation will result in consequences for the Maduro regime. The United States reaffirms its support for Guyana's territorial integrity. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because it's been a while since I made a video on Venezuela. And what we've seen is that Donald Trump taking over as the president in the USA looks like being bad news for Venezuela. Over the past couple of years, things have started to improve slightly as a result of that license that was granted to Chevron to enable it to try to recoup some of the money that it was owed by the Venezuelan authorities, and also to allow some oil to be exported to the USA. So there was a double benefit from the US's point of view. However, Donald Trump has now come in and revoked that license, partly because the US is saying that it doesn't need any of those imports anymore. It doesn't need the Venezuelan oil. And also because President Maduro has not been able to prove that he held a fair election. There's a lot of talk that the recent election that took place in 2024 was rigged, that the opposition didn't stand a chance, and so the sanctions have now been reapplied. And that's going to be really bad news for Venezuela because its oil industry is really underperforming. We saw right at the beginning of today's video that Venezuela has the largest supplies in the world. Its reserves are absolutely huge, much bigger than Canada and Russia and the USA, bigger in fact than all three of those countries added together. I know the grade of the oil is slightly different, so it's more difficult to extract and actually refine than some of those other countries, but the fact remains that it has a huge amount of oil sitting under the ground. But because of the regime and the way that it's been operated, and the fact that a lot of the equipment was nationalized by the communist government, many countries have walked away and the sanctions were applied against Venezuela. And the country simply hasn't been reinvesting into the equipment. So it's now old and decrepit and isn't fit for purpose in a lot of situations. And the Chevron facility that was reoperating was actually giving them some hope that it could be expanded and develop more facilities. But we're now seeing that closed down. And it's likely that Venezuela will now have less oil production than its neighbour Guyana, despite the fact that Guyana has much smaller reserves. And so President Maduro has now turned his sights to ESSEQIBO, this area of Guyana that Venezuelans claim should be part of Venezuela, that the British stole back in 1796 or sometime around then. They want it back. And it just happens that that area also has lots of oil, lots of gas, diamonds and gold by coincidence. So I think that's probably the main driver as to why they want that back. And also ExxonMobil is producing oil there very nicely. So I think Venezuela is looking at that thinking we would quite like to have that facility. And what we've seen is that Venezuela has actually built up its troops. It sent around 5,000 soldiers to the area, to the border area, and it's also got lots of vessels sitting just off the waters of Guyana. And as we talked about earlier, one of those vessels actually entered Guyanan water recently, and it was told by the USA that if that happens again, there will be serious consequences. And it will be interesting to see whether or not anything develops, whether we see Venezuela making an attempt to try to take over the ESSEQIBO area or whether or not they don't. But likelihood is something will happen. And what we've also seen in today's video is that since Donald Trump took over, he's changed a lot of the rules in terms of migration. Previously, Venezuelans were allowed to live in the USA under this TPS. However, that's now been cancelled, and there is a risk that potentially 600,000 Venezuelans could be deported back to Venezuela at Venezuela's cost over the course of 2025. And obviously, if that happens, it'll be interesting to see what they're going to do, because there isn't a lot of unfilled jobs and employment waiting for all of those people. So it's likely that if they did get deported, they would probably leave Venezuela and maybe try to make their way back to the USA. But the overall summary of today's video is that things look to be getting worse for Venezuela since Donald Trump has taken over. They're seeing a reduction in terms of their oil capacity. They're seeing a reduction in terms of their exports because the USA no longer wants any Venezuelan oil. And it's likely that lots of people could potentially be deported out of the USA back to Venezuela, and that's going to prove problematic as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you to everybody that's supporting the channel, either through Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube Super Thanks or Patreon or YouTube membership. Really, really appreciate that support. And here's something to put a smile on everybody's face.